Kelsa and Liz sat across from Claude von Klaus, the self-proclaimed dictator of Maya, his mask the shape of a leather bird continuing to split, revealing two lines of razor-sharp teeth as he bit into his mill. Liz, curious, pulled up the tablecloth on her end and took a peek below. When her face resurfaced, Claude's mask twisted upward in a grotesque smile as Liz expressed pure disgust. I'll ask your forgiveness. I seem to have forgotten what is and isn't quite acceptable in Abel Company's presence. He snapped his fingers, and the woman from before climbed back from under the table and went off back up the escalator. Now then, about my offer. You will be well compensated, of course. What's mine is yours. Well, mostly anyway. He made a large sweep of his hand as if to show the grandeur of his coastal empire. Liz looked absolutely irate at this point and was starting to stand when Kelsa's hand grabbed her wrist. We'll accept, of course. We'd be foolish to do otherwise. Liz's eyes were ablaze at this point. Like hell, Kelsa gripped her wrist more tightly and shot her an icy glare. They stood like that a moment, Claude not seeming to pay much attention to them. Excellent, he said. And not to worry, Miss Elizabeth. You'll find our hospitality unmatched here. Claude snapped his fingers, and the elder responsible for guiding them had reappeared. Escort these women to my personal tower. They will have the guest floor. The elder made a bow and beckoned them to follow. Liz was staring daggers towards Claude, who didn't seem to pay her much mind. Esther, the fox carbuncle summoned by Kelsa, jumped on the table, snatching a bread roll before trotting alongside them to the escalator up. They were once again in the very fanciful restaurant where town-goers appeared to be dining as if nothing were wrong. The fat man in the trench coat stood near the exit, his eyes set in a deep purple. He moved out the door as they started their approach and had vanished by the time they exited. The day had already passed, it seemed. There was a bit of a chill in the salty air. The streets were desolate, and Kelsa couldn't help but shake a bit as the wind bit into her. We probably should get Nell first, Kelsa said, looking over at Liz, who wouldn't meet her gaze. She leaned in as if to whisper, Trust me on this, Liz. She let out a sigh, and they continued behind the elder. Not to worry. You've been moved already, along with your belongings, rest assured. Kelsa's face bunched in confusion. What if we refuse to stay on as guardians of this place? The elder stopped suddenly and turned towards them, his eyes going from a milky bluish color to a purple-tinged haze. No one refuses Claude von Klaus. A smile danced across his wrinkled face before he turned back and began walking again. A deep guttural scream pierced the air. Oh dear, seems we have an unwanted visitor. Sounds like they didn't make it very far. They never do. A flash of bright white light blinded them momentarily. Whatever was going on over there was serious. Another scream was heard, and a much weaker flash lit up the dark area in the distance. Kelsa gave a look to Liz, and they started sprinting towards the ensuing battle, Esther close behind them. Approaching, they tucked into an alleyway between two buildings and looked on to see a dark-skinned man pinned down by four townspeople. A fifth one, the same woman from the aquarium, was caressing his head. Get off of me! Get off! Lou! The man was interrupted by the woman's hand covering his mouth. Her eyes, deep purple, stared back at him, and she gave a small smile. Just behind them was another group of several townspeople holding down what seemed to be a small child. It was clear it was putting up a fight, as one or two of them were thrown backwards by some invisible force, only to be replaced by two more of the gathering crowd surrounding them. No need to fear. Kelsa practically jumped out of her skin as the elder tapped her shoulder. Master Klaus should be here shortly. After these words were uttered, a well-dressed man in a plague doctor mask strutted forward from the crevice of the building directly beside them. She felt quite uneasy seeing the monster again. He proceeded to the smallest one first, raised his hand, and several more came over and lifted the child up into the air. It was now clear that this was no child. The eyes were a transparent-like color that glowed brightly, and the mouth had been stitched shut. Whether by design or torture, she was unsure. It was clear that it was exhausted and could no longer produce the force it was generating before to throw back its assailants. Claude stepped closer, and Liz dropped to her knees and began to puke as the mask opened once more, revealing a syringe-like tubule that stuck into its neck. A bright white liquid was being siphoned from the boy. The light drained from its eyes, and its arms fell limp after no more than a minute. A purplish substance filled the needle-like protrusion and seemed to inject itself into the sagging form. The procedure completed, the boy was dropped to the ground where he hit like a sack of bricks. A few seconds later it began moving and stood up facing Claude. Its eyes now had a hint of purple to them and were a shadow of their once bright nature. Kelsa had failed to notice that the man was propped and was made to watch the horrible conversion of his presumed familiar. His eyes were bloodshot, his face covered in tears as he tried to scream, but the woman still held firm against his lip. A flash of purple behind Claude's mask saw her loosen and his wails of lament escape. "You sick bastard! What did you do to him?" Claude's mask twisted into that same sickening smile. "The same thing I intend to do to you, my boy." The newly converted creature walked over and took one of the restrained hands of the man. "It's okay, Jeremy. It'll be over soon. Then we can be together again." Kelsa was unsure how it was talking. There was no movement on its face. Tears poured down the man's face as he continued to make futile efforts to break free, only to find himself out of breath. Claude began his approach after savoring the scene a moment longer. The mask opened and the syringe-like protrusion shot forward, plunging deep into his neck. Dark crimson filled it this time, and slowly was siphoned away. Moans and screams of agony were all that could be heard for the next 5 minutes. They grew progressively weaker until his body hung limp in the grasp of the many townspeople. The purple substance once again filled the tube and slowly began pumping into the poor soul. When his body was finally released, the boy creature knelt beside him until he stirred once more. Still holding his hand, they both rose to their feet and faced toward Claude, their new master. No words were given. Only a wave, and the crowd began to disperse. Claude Van Klaus looked over to the alleyway where Kelsa and Liz had been watching. "Terribly sorry you had to see that, ladies. I trust you are both very tired by now and are in much need of some rest." The mask twisted into that same sick smile, and Claude was gone a moment later. "Now then, if you'd follow me," the elder said and walked in front of the two of them. Liz's face had gone from one of anger to one of complete fear after witnessing that horrible ordeal that took place in front of them. Did you see the way their bodies just kind of gave out? And then they came back without any kind of will of their own." It was clear that she was shaken bad by Claude and his sick antics. They were led to a large building several stories high. The lobby was decorated in ocean-themed decorum and had a very gift shop antiquity feel to it. The front desk had 3 souls behind it, 2 of them very familiar, the man and the creature that were accosted not even a few minutes before. Each of them had a bellboy hat on and waved with a smile as they approached. "Welcome to Klaus Tower," the boy creature said, no movement coming from its face. "Are you two feeling all right?" Kelsa managed, staring back at the dark-skinned man. "Never better," he replied with a warm smile that certainly didn't belong on his face. "You'll be staying on the guest floor, number 13. Here's your elevator key." He reached down and pulled out a circular key that had a shriveled hand attached to the backside of it. Kelsa felt herself cringe a bit as it was placed in her outstretched hand. "Your friend should already be up there waiting for you. Have a good one." He had that same overdone smile plastered across his face. They made their way to the elevator, slotted the key into it, and pressed the 13th floor button. It slowly rose up, and they felt even more uneasy as the elevator music seemed to jump and skip as they ascended. The door opened to a banquet hall-sized pavilion that overlooked a good portion of the city on one side and into the ocean on the other. Esther was already glued to the glass as they continued in and found Nell propped on a sofa in the middle of the room, staring at the first television they had seen since coming here. His expression was pretty sour, and the remnants of the smashed remote controller lay in front of his feet on a small coffee table. There were at least 3 empty tankards in front of him. Finally. "Oh, welcome. Sorry, I had ordered more refreshments, but service appears to be slow." Nell pressed a button of a tankard set into the coffee table and it beeped loudly. "Where have you been? What if we needed you?" Liz slapped the back of his head. Nell didn't say anything, just stared back at the television, which had a familiar face dancing upon the screen. It was that woman who Claude had seemed to favor. She looked much livelier and was laughing alongside some other man she didn't recognize. They were having a picnic of sorts when a frail-looking man stepped forward. He was well dressed and had a hardback briefcase that matched his suit. He apologized for interrupting them and took a seat and began explaining who he was. He helped himself to some of their food, and everything seemed all right, actually, despite the sudden appearance of this stranger. The frail man and the lover of the woman shook hands, and the three of them went back to town. As it came into view, it was immediately apparent that it was the very same Maya where they now stood. They made their way to a medium-sized building bearing a sign of a Red Cross and the word hospital. The two men made their way further in and were standing in front of a young man who lay still, only the machines around him keeping him alive. The frail man raised a hand to the first and reminded him not to interfere once the procedure began, regardless of how it may appear. The man gave a nod, and the frail one opened his case, revealing the plague doctor mask. "Is that Claude?" Kelsa began, but was quickly shushed by Nil, Liz hanging over him and watching as well. As he lifted the mask to his face, it almost seemed to voraciously wrap around his head, as if to consume it. Claude struggled a moment, and then relaxed as it settled on his face. He skulked over to the boy and lifted him against the headboard. The mask opened and the needle shot forward into the boy. The man behind him covered his own mouth to stifle abject horror, but did not interfere. The syringe filled crimson and then purple as they had grown accustomed to seeing, and then the boy slumped back onto the bed. Claude reached up to remove the mask and struggled against it a moment before the other man stepped forward and helped it off of him. He was visibly out of breath, and the two of them looked forward at the boy, which had begun to twitch, and rose with a slight purple tinge in his eyes at first. The man began to cry and called out for his wife. The woman from before came in and squeezed into an impossible hug between the three of them. Claude placed the mask back into the case and waved goodbye to the three of them. But the man had stopped him, threw his arms around him. The screen grew fuzzy, and Claude was shown helping more and more of the people in the hospital, the mask becoming more difficult to remove each time he donned it. The last one had something to the tune of 4 men wrestling it from his face. Another flashed forward, and Klaus was standing over a murder scene, a bloody knife painting the ground next to a frail-looking old woman. He donned the mask, bent over her, and the same ritual commenced. Only this time, when he stood, something didn't seem right. He didn't attempt to remove the mask, simply turned and strode off. This time, the screen showed him with the original family sitting in a cafe reading a paper headlining the murders of Maya and the miracles of Dr. Klaus. The man, his wife, and their son each looked at Claude in revulsion as the mask he wouldn't remove opened, revealing sharp teeth, and scraped against the dining utensils he had used for his breakfast. The man had appeared to have said something to Claude, and the paper fell from his face. They stared across at one another before the mask wrinkled into that grotesque smile, and the woman had let out a scream. She made for the door, but was caught by the hem of her sundress and pulled close to him. The husband made to wrench her free, but Claude's body went from that of the frail man they had met some time ago to a very well-muscled, athletic build. He made to strike at him, and the blow knocked him loose of her. The husband grappled Claude to the floor and pummeled his face, blow after blow. The assault had stopped after the 5th hit, as the child stood over his father, a steak knife dripping in blood in his hand. The man collapsed to the floor, holding the side of his neck. The mother had screamed again and ran for the door, but was met by the old woman who was reanimated to serve her savior's whim. Claude pulled himself to his feet and slowly walked forward. She screamed, pushed at the old woman, who had tightly held her, much stronger than any old woman should have been. It wasn't long before Claude had caressed her neck and went to work siphoning her essence. After she dropped to the ground, loud shots were fired from some of the city's law enforcement. He dropped to the ground, apparently dead. The holes that had pierced Claude healed over with purple-like scars that twisted the flesh back together, and the old woman collapsed to the ground, a corpse once more. The officers approached, unsure of the situation. One was quickly wrestled to the ground by the woman, who now had a purple shade glazing her eyes, and the second one made to run, but was caught and bit by the child in the neck. Claude rose, dusted himself off, and his mask wrinkled into a wry smile, and the screen went blank. "I think I'm going to be sick." Liz put a hand up to her mouth and ran off in search of the bathroom. "That certainly was entertaining," Nell began while starting to press the button set into the table once more. The elevator opened, and the summon belonging to that man from before was holding a tray of mugs. He walked over, and Nell snatched one off of the platter. Kelsa didn't waste time grabbing one as well and fervently drank it, given the recent events she had witnessed. I can't believe that sick fuck tricked all of these people into thinking he was here to help them. Nell belched and grabbed another tankard. I can. Esther had finally made his way over and hopped onto the sofa next to Nell. This place is really big, and you can see so much. He didn't seem to take much notice of the oppressive atmosphere and darted off once again in the opposite direction to continue exploring. Kelsa was getting a headache, and while she knew her body needed sleep, the horrifics of all she had witnessed tonight kept her far from peace of mind enough to attempt it. Any idea where the beds are, Nell? She asked, but was met with silence as Nell settled in front of the repeating program once more. The scene of the picnic felt all the more ominous now that Kelsa surmised its origins. Esther popped around the corner and wagged one of its many tails at her. She followed along and was led to the bedroom, which was as grand as the rest of their accommodations. Liz had already fell asleep in a bed so large that 7 people could have slept comfortably in it. Across the way was a slightly smaller one that Kelsa decided on for herself. She lay down, and Esther curled up beside her. She was plagued with nightmares of Claude's horrific mask, and the performance he had gave sickened her very being. These people were his slaves now, at his beck and call for any sick whim that he might dream up. She couldn't help but wonder if that could be their fate as well. All of the ordeals leading up to the present only to become another slave of Maya to this monster. Would they be used, toyed with, just another plaything? She snapped awake to an inhuman screeching coming from the direction of the pavilion where Nell had been. Liz had still been fast asleep, but Esther was quicker still to awaken. Kelsa ran over and shook Liz, who had somehow managed to work her way off the side of the impossibly large bed, her legs hanging off of the side. Liz, get up. Something's wrong. I think Claude is here. Liz snored loudly before slowly rousing. Listen, I think Klaus is here. And he is Nell. Liz sluggishly got up and reached over for a rifle propped against the wall. Kelsa had already started out the door, cautiously looking about her. Down the way, she saw Nell standing in front of Klaus, who was clutching his head and still letting out those horrible noises. To taste the blood of oblivion. Nell stood, his arms crossed. I could have told you that was a poor idea. Now, the question is how you will pay for accosting a prince. Claude swiped at Nell, who effortlessly sidestepped it. There were 10 others standing around them, but each were held by tentacles rising from pools of black. Claude finally steadied himself, the black blood having run its course. Sight him! And the mask opened up again, let out a loud screech that shattered the glass windows and forced even Nell's hands to his ears. The tentacles loosed and they began to pile on top of him. Liz turned the corner and raised the rifle up, sinking a shot directly into Claude's head. He collapsed to the floor, but was back on his feet within seconds, one of the slaves dropping to the ground to supplement his healing. Etukat! Estrelain! The rifle dropped from Liz's hands, and she dropped to the ground, unable to move for some reason. Kelsa scrambled back around the corner with her just before a large ball of purplish energy whizzed by them, colliding with a large cabinet at the end of the floor and blowing parts of the ceiling and flooring away. I've already analyzed all of you. You're 23 levels below me. Easy prey. Just give up. Make it easy on all of us. I promise to treat you well. Kelsa gritted her teeth, Liz limp in her hands, breathing but paralyzed. Levels? She had completely forgotten about this. She pulled up the interface as quickly as she could and noticed she was level 3. Had 12 points to distribute. She dumped them into luck and then hit the summon tab, which had a thumbnail of Esther. The first spell was some kind of heal. It had the word Enavera. Everything else had been grayed out. She closed the interface, and not a moment later Claude was standing just in front of her. Nell was restrained by 5 of the 9 slaves he had brought with him, not too far off. Kelsa pushed herself backward to try and put some distance between them, but was quickly restrained as Claude dived on top of her, his mask drooling. It had begun to open, revealing the needle when he suddenly stopped and turned behind him, to see Nell, standing free, the 5 that were restraining him gone, the black residue of his portal magic still lingering about the floor. The leather bunched into a frown. Estrelain! A ball of purple light flared towards Nell but was reflected by Esther, mid-flight and sent back at Claude. Kelsa felt her body being pulled into the ground, a black ring forming beneath her. The mass squashed flat against Claude's face before it sent him flying across the opposite wall where he hit and fell face first onto the floor. Liz had finally been able to move again and had picked up the rifle and fired 3 more shots of it into Claude. He immediately began healing, but 2 more of his escorts fell to the ground. They started towards her, but were stopped by tentacles emerging and thrown from the side of the building. Looks like you're all out, you sick bastard. Kelsa spat, her heart beating frantically out of her chest. Claude pulled himself to his feet and was met with another bullet that knocked him back. It healed over all the same, despite there not appearing to be any more of his living corpses around. This whole city belongs to me. You can't win no matter what you choose to do. You belong to me now. He picked himself up and was met with another rifle round knocking him back into the wall. A ding was heard and 10 more villagers poured onto the floor. Nice of you to keep your master waiting, he said, his mask twisting upward. Nell managed to throw 3 of them from the building before being hit by the paralysis spell Claude cast. Liz frantically began to reload the lever action and Kelsa made to punch one of the approaching minions. Both were wrestled to the ground quickly enough. Kelsa saw that Esther was already captured as well, held up by 2 of his many tails and struggling aimlessly. Finally, now then. Claude stood once more and strode towards Liz, who was closest of the 3. A fine specimen to add to my collection. You'll serve me well, I'm sure. The mask began to open. Liz was screaming as the syringe plunged into her neck and began siphoning her blood. Kelsa looked over to Nell, who twitched, the paralysis still binding him. Let her go, Claude. Please, no. She was reduced to pleading. What could she do? Anavera! Esther's purple gem lit up the room and Liz began to glow with a golden aura. The syringe protruding from her neck began to glow as well, and Claude seemed to almost melt with pleasure as it continued siphoning. It gave her the time she needed, and a tentacle wrapped around Claude's leg and whipped him backwards into some of the glass that hadn't shattered yet. Spiderweb tracks formed along it, and Claude fell through it, apparently having fallen. Nell, he'll be back up here soon. We need to go. Can you use your portal? Nell was visibly exhausted, panting and looking at the remaining slaves who were making their way towards them. One of them had broken off and went towards the pane. No, I cannot. My mana is depleted, Nell said painfully. The slave went to a knee and reached out the window, pulling up Claude, who had apparently managed to catch the ledge before falling. That was a close one. The mask retched into a smile. He started forward, but was caught by the slave. It was the fat guy in the brown overcoat. His eyes were flashing from brown to purple. Unhand me, knave. The grip only seemed to tighten. I said let me go. How are you resisting my commands? No. It cannot be. 157. How? Esterlane! He yelled, and the purple energy began building up, aimed directly at the fat man. The overcoated hero's other hand reached up and clasped the mask together with a Herculean effort. There was a loud explosion as the back of Claude's head mushroomed out as if he had been hit with a shotgun point blank. His mangled corpse fell from the window, and the people of Maya finally knew rest, each of them collapsing to the ground dead once more. The last thing Kelsa remembered seeing was the notepad and pencil scratching away as her world faded to black. She awoke on the large bed next to Liz, Nell on the other one, fast asleep. She could taste the salt and death in the air as she awoke. The bodies of the dead were mostly piles of decay, the age having already been dead for so long catching up to them in an instant. She couldn't help but feel sorry for the suffering they all must have endured, but at the same time they seemed unaware and happily living not long before. They were already dead, but none of them seemed to know it. Her bedmate shifted and Kelsa threw her arms around her. Liz, I thought he had gotten you. I thought you were going to die. She returned Kelsa's relief with a sigh of drowsiness. Before long, everyone had awoken and were standing, staring over the city where life was present no longer. They made their way down to the ground floor, greeted only by more piles of rot. Just outside the door, they saw the leather plague doctor mask lying near an empty suit. Liz and Kelsa both shared a distasteful look at it. Now, get rid of it. Liz said. Nell smiled, and it fell through the black portal he had summoned. I have a few interesting ideas for an artifact of this power. Liz looked back to Kelsa. So, where now? Black told us about two other areas of interest, the children to the far north and some kind of pyromancer to the east, right? But I'm not sure I want to deal with any of it, to be honest. Liz's stomach began to growl, and they decided to find some food first. They went off to the oceanside restaurant and indeed found that while the patrons were no longer lively, the food was most certainly still edible. It turns out Nell's an excellent cook. There they sat, savoring that they had survived, when something caught the corner of Kelsa's eye. A glittering object sitting on a coffee table towards the center of the lounge area. Picking it up, she found it was a map detailing a large fortress-like structure. It had many entry points that Claude had supposedly planned to attack should the need arise later on. The Mad King Osiris and his familiar Ocelot bolstered forces that supposedly would pose a threat to Maya sooner or later. Dear listeners, we now implore you to decide the pathway of our adventure. Should Kelsa and Liz pursue the children amassing the army to the far north? Or perhaps the pyromancer to the east, enslaving citizens and burning homes to the ground? Or maybe this new option, the Mad King who has already amassed a sizable force. If Claude saw him as a potential threat, perhaps the king would feel the same. Let's write a story. Let's play a game without the dice.